question to the moderator. Is that okay? Do you hear me? Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can begin this closing panel. I'm pleased to welcome you again for this panel and the last one of our workshop. I hope that your discussions in the various breakout groups this morning went well. I went from one to another to just see, and I saw that the discussion were going well, even if at the beginning that was perhaps a bit chaotic, and sorry for that. I'm delighted because it was really the objective of this workshop to allow you to exchange views and make proposals. So the objective of this panel now, the last one, is to present the main points of conclusion of the two working sessions of this morning. I will ask you to be indulgent because the chairs have had very little time to make their synthesis, and for session one to combine it with that of their colleagues from the other groups. So as we are all impatient to know what was said in these groups, I will call directly Tracy Cumming to report on the synthesis of the work of the 8 breakout groups in session 1 on the proposals for key actions to align financial flows with biodiversity policies. Tracy was chairing the group 6, here she is, and she made a synthesis of all groups during the second hour of this morning. So Tracy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Adil.
I don't hear you. You are
coming through? Am I coming through now?
Moderator, can you open the mic of Tracy?
Am I coming through now? No?
You can, moderator, please, can you? Okay.
Okay,
I have a message.
Some people can hear me,
but I don't hear you. So
I'll keep speaking if that's okay. Okay, so we had a fantastic discussion in group 6, and it looks like, looking at everyone else's notes, there were really good discussions in all the groups. So I've tried to summarize points that were raised for all actors that came from the groups, and then a couple of specific points from key stakeholders. So firstly, all stakeholders, we need clearer definitions, science-based metrics, standards and targets, and a need for common ground and a multi-stakeholder approach in developing these. We need to address the misalignment of timescales between actions taken in the finance sector and ecological impact. We need better linkages between biodiversity finance and climate change and nature-based solutions, though not letting biodiversity become subsumed by climate change issues, as well as better linkages between social aspects with biodiversity, including poverty alleviation and a focus on Indigenous peoples. We need to align businesses with the science-based targets and actions that are being taken in the finance sector, including but not limited to specific mention of mitigation hierarchy. There was a proposal to consider prioritization in the most harmful industries, including looking at sectors that have the biggest risk and impact and dealing with those first. There were points on the importance of an interface and dialogue between government and the finance sector, and the value of having national biodiversity finance plans to help guide this process. Then a couple of points specifically coming up from the private sector actors. There were points on the need to speed up and scale up de-risking solutions, including blended finance for nature positive investments. There was quite a strong call for stronger government support to do all of these things, including enabling a landscape financing approach, and also to deal with stranded assets and think about transition finance to help with that, or even better, transition thinking in how we deal with the finance sector and the private sector. Proposals that came specifically around the public finance sector were around reflecting on the important role that DFIs can and should play through developing and helping public and private institutions apply their performance standards, obviously including environmental performance standards, the need to identify activities that clearly should no longer be financed, and the importance of aligning these with the G7 statement on nature and the draft joint statement language on to minimize impact. I think I've got that right. I'm not sure if I have. On central banks, there was a comment on including stress tests in central banks. I think originally stress tests were just included as an action around public sector MDBs, but here there was a statement around stress tests being included for central banks, as well as regulators and supervisors, and the requirement of disclosing on the alignment of central banks with biodiversity goals. Finally, focusing in on governments, there were statements around how governments are critical for leveling the playing field, for the need for governments to require data disclosure, directing what public banks invest in, and a statement that voluntary asks from the private sector are not going to be effective enough. And if the government doesn't step in, we're not going to get to where we need to be. The importance of addressing harmful subsidies came up from a number of groups, as well as the need to put in clear milestones as different governments try and address this over the next 10 years. Also, the need to send from governments very clear signals to the finance sector on the importance of biodiversity and specifically the long-term intent of governments on how they want this to be dealt with. And finally, this idea that governments should also be taking a landscape approach and networking between stakeholders that are operating in one landscape. So multiple finance actors and businesses that are operating in one landscape should be addressed by governments so that these things speak to each other and we have better coherence. So that's a very quick, rather messy summary of everything that came across all those 8 groups. I know that there will be a fantastic summary developed a little later, hopefully sometime next week, pulling all this together, which will be sent out. So I hope that covered as much as I can at this point.
Thank you, Tracy, for your summary. You did a very, very good work in just an hour with all the chairs. So thanks for that. Also, you have presented the synthesis of the 8 groups. Do one or two chair of this session want to add something to this synthesing, something which should have been missed, express a strong disagreement, complete it? Is there any willingness from any chairs for this first session to complete the synthesis? Yes, I see, I don't know the name. A question from Caroline van Lenders. Can you? Yes, please, Caroline.
Congratulations. And I think it is a great topic and such open discussions, very special. Can you give me the floor to do a short offer from our group, an offer to bring together a task force of countries that are interested to take this agenda forward? And we see all these partnerships and coalitions building within the private sector, and we know that there's this CBD process, official process, but is there a space to come together as countries to learn from each other on all these topics that I mentioned today, on definitions, on what we can do or what we should do, maybe temporarily? From the Netherlands, we want to offer to support such a process if there's an interest, and that's just what I would like to add from the group that I chaired. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Any other compliment from any other chair for this first session? I see no hand raised. So, yes, Jessica from UNEP-FI.
Great, thanks, Odile, and well done, Tracy, for that great consolidation. I think one point that came up in our group that I thought was very useful was, the need to have biodiversity data so that it can be integrated into financial risk return models and calculations. And currently, that data is quite dispersed. So there was a suggestion in our group to fund and capacitate conservation organizations to actually provide that data without paywalls. So a multi-stakeholder approach to making sure that data is available, through a common portal without a paywall.
That's a good point. And surely also the need to translate this data in data understandable and quickly applicable by financial institutions also. Any other comment or complement from all the groups? I don't see any hand raised, so thank you. Thank you, Tracy. The synthesis was good. If anyone, and that was sure, has anything to add. So there is a lot of material coming from all this group this morning. It's a bit complicated to synthesize that, but you did the synthesis. I see a strong need of cooperation and collaboration. That was said yesterday, but it was also said this morning. Governments need to help, need to enable the financial sector and above all perhaps the private one to finance biodiversity and to manage biodiversity risks also. But on the other side, there is I see something. There is a strong need to help from the financial sector. What you was saying us, Tracy, with some concern, also with some consideration that have also to be taken into account. Financing the transitions, that means also be able to manage the transition, to manage the assets which will not be financeable at all. So a need of clear tool, of clear inputs, of clear insights, and a strong cooperation between all of them. I see that Anne-Marie Bor is asking the floor.
Thank you very much. And congratulations, Odile, with the event and all the outcome. It was a pleasure to lead the corporate group, breakout group number 1. And we had a leading company in there. And I was very happy also with that they were bringing forward responsibility on the topic, but also early developments on linking up the value chain and all data through the value chain. So it seems there are really pieces of the puzzle coming together. And I found it very, I was happy to hear this. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. If there is no other persons asking the floor, perhaps we'll go directly to the synthesis of breakout of the session 2. I see a question. Perhaps I promise you today to have a Q&A session, to have time for that, because we didn't have yesterday. So after the debrief of session 2, thank you. So we'll now proceed to the report of the work of the breakout group 2. As you can imagine, the chairs did not have the time to make a global synthesis as Tracy did for the session 1. So what we propose to you is that 2 chairs come and share with you the result of their own breakout group, and after that others will complete if necessary. So I ask Mr. Eppel, who was chairing the breakout group 5 with representative of governments and regulators, and Mr. Tobin, who was chairing the breakout group 2 with private banks, to raise their hands first and to present the key concluding points of their groups. So, Jeremy, can you perhaps begin?
Thank you, Odile. Very good to be back on this, and glad to see so many people still here at this time on a Friday. As you say, we've only had 25 minutes since our group ended, so I've not even attempted to get input from the others. So this will be very much what I heard in the chairing of my own group, group 5 in session 2. But hopefully it will resonate, and we'll be interested to hear from others who've got similar experience, what they want to add to it. one of the key things I think I heard was the importance of thinking, and remember the question for this group was, what is it that the Global Biodiversity Framework could or should do in order to enable the financial sector to make its greatest contribution? So to deliver on the kind of proposals and actions and ideas that you were discussing in session 1. And in terms of that, there was a lot of messages came through from the participants in my group that learning from what happened in the climate experience would be very important, both what worked and what didn't work, or what could have worked better. And I think one of the messages that I took away strongly was that providing clear definitions of what we mean by certain terms was going to be really important. So if we're talking, for instance, about nature-based solutions, we need to be clear what actually we mean and what the safeguards are, so that there's an understanding both amongst communities and individuals in countries, but also amongst the financial sector about what we really mean here. And where does that fit in the big picture? Where does it fit in the framework of the overarching expectations of what the Global Biodiversity Framework is trying to deliver? Another important discussion I think we had, and quite a lot of contributions from different parts of the globe and different experiences came in my group, was about what we can learn about alignment. The term alignment, which has been suggested as something that could be built into the Global Biodiversity Framework, a goal of aligning. There was reference to the Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, where there's talk about alignment of financial institutions. And here it was stressed that it was important that it was both public and private financial institutions that might need to be aligned. But again, clarity about definitions, aligning with what and by when, because alignment instantly or in the next 2 years would be a very different proposition from alignment over 5, 10 or 20 years. So there was a need, it was felt within the GBF, to be clear about if alignment was mentioned, over what time frame and what kind of transition was required. And there was also a clear suggestion that this message needed to go through strongly to those who regulate the financial sector, that a mandate was needed from central banks and the governors of financial institutions, that the central banks really needed to provide leadership in this space towards whatever that overarching framing, objective, goal, whatever the right terminology is in the GBF, whether it was nature positive or some other framing. It needed to be clear that there was a leadership role for central bank governors. And that was, again, a lesson that people took strongly from what had happened in the climate space, that progress in the financial sector towards net zero, towards 1.5 degrees, towards climate goals, was very much something that had been helped by the leadership and the drive from central bank governors and regulators. So that was definitely something to read across. And I think a fourth, and perhaps unexpected, but I think very significant comment that also came from someone who had a lot of experience in the climate space, but also has been involved in the TNFD informal working group, was how important it is for the financial sector to be able to do scenario planning about alternative futures that might achieve the same ultimate goal of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So whatever that goal or goals would be, however they're eventually expressed in the final document, that they are in terms in which the financial sector is capable of taking them into its own scenario planning about future risk and opportunity and the impacts that they create on nature. So I think that was a very interesting comment, that we needed to make sure that the GBF, in the way it's framed, was user-friendly for scenario planning by the financial sector. So as you'll see, Odile, these are quite sort of strategic, long-term issues, many of them, but we are thinking about the overarching framework of how does the GBF speak to the financial sector in this context. So I then abused my privilege as chair, and in a completely unscientific way, since we had 40 people in this breakout group, I asked them to put their hands down and then put them up again to answer a single question, without any prescription as to what the language would be or how it would be expressed, but simply, did they think it would be useful to have some kind of financial sector target reference to the importance of the financial sector in a target in the global biodiversity framework? Yes or no? Hands up, please, if you think yes. You won't be held accountable for this, but simply, in the most unscientific way, what do you think? A straw poll. And 24 of the 40 put their hands up and thought it would be useful. So I offer that as a closing comment. Completely unscientific, but interesting nevertheless. And I'm sure that chairs of other groups in this session would have other things to add. And I'd be interested to hear if any of the same points came up. So thank you. I hope that was some help.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy, for your summary. Really, really interesting. John, can you please come up with the voice of the financial sector this time? Thanks.
Thank you, Odile. Yes, I'd be happy to. And thanks to text messaging and WhatsApp, I have at least some initial feedback from the other finance breakout groups, which is helpful, at least in order to find that those discussions seem to have been broadly consistent with how the discussion developed in breakout group 2, which is the one that I chaired, even though there's some surprising and interesting differences between the groups. But as you might expect in a setting like this, in a limited time period, there were a number of insightful interventions. Not surprisingly, it was more difficult to make specific proposals on how to deal with some of the issues that are raised for and by the finance sector in respect of biodiversity broadly, and in respect of the global biodiversity framework for the 2021-2030 period specifically. But that said, some clear concerns that some of which may be addressable. I would probably argue that the most prominent, at least within my own breakout group, was a concern about vagueness. Finance sector representatives were concerned about possibility that there were some general targets or goals within the GBF that did not have clear enough numbers or guidelines for implementation attached that may then be picked up, adopted, turned into national law or regulation from multinational groups or multi-state groups such as the EU, and not give the finance sector the predictability, the clear instructions that it needs. And this was reflected in the initial discussion within at least breakout group 2 about the specific goal that has been proposed in one form or another over the course of the past few months that seeks to align finance sector activity with nature positive outcomes by 2030, and a full alignment by 2050 is one of the proposals that are out there. And the representatives really expressed concern about the fact that, okay, what does this translate into for the finance sector? Biodiversity is a much more complex area than climate. There is no single target like metric tons of CO2 equivalent or like degrees Celsius that one can use and apply across sectors. So there was quite a bit of concern about that. Another topic that I think came up that is interesting was that of harmful subsidies. And there was a concern that if countries move towards reducing or eliminating harmful subsidies, it would be critical for the finance sector to have clear guidance on what would happen to specific sectors where subsidies may impact corporates and understand ahead of time how that reform will be implemented across sectors. And another point that I wanted to raise was brought up by several different participants in breakout group 2, as well as some of the other breakout groups, and that is the need to understand the impacts and dependencies of on biodiversity in finance sector portfolios. And a related point, since portfolios, after all, involves sort of relationships with clients in the real economy, it became clear that it would be ideal, to say the least, and probably necessary for a successful outcome, for financial institutions' activities not just to be aligned with the GVF. That's something we discussed, that's a given, or that's a premise, if you will, but that financial institutions' activities be aligned with the activities of their corporate clients. So there was this parallel theme that came up of, yes, financial institution activity aligned with biodiversity, but in order to achieve that, we have to have this other form of alignment, corporates and the real economy with financial institutions. Various people brought up the issue of metrics, unsurprisingly, and the importance of having clear and unambiguous metrics for success. And the final point that I would bring up, which is more of a conclusion, since I've alluded to it already, but the importance of regulation, smart regulation, unambiguous regulation, because while many in the private sector may somewhat reluctantly accept the importance of regulation, I think eventually most actors in the finance sector recognize that no regulation or vague regulation can be equally bad. And good, smart, clear regulation is what ultimately leads to private sector success, as well as aligns clearly with public sector goals. And I will leave it there. And I believe you're on mute. There we go. Now we can hear you, Odile.
Yes, thank you. Before we conclude, I want to ask other chairs if they have something to add, because you didn't have the time to make any synthesis, and perhaps chairs from the two other type of groups, that means the public finance and the civil society. So I don't. Andrew Dutz from the civil society, or Onno van Evel, do you want to add something to these two summaries? And I also see, so Andrew, you raised your hand, so please go on. And I also see that Martin is asking the floor. Andrew, please. Can the moderator give the floor to Andrew Dutz from the Nature Conservancy? Thank you.
Thanks. So thanks. I not much to add from the summary that John and Jeremy already gave, but just a couple of key points. There was a lot of discussion about the fact that we really need governments to step up with strong regulations and incentives to provide the framework for private sector actors, right? The sentiment was that the private sector is not going to get where we want it to go on its own through voluntary measures. And so they need to get the right signals from the private sector, or from governments, in setting up the right frameworks. That was probably one of the key points. There was also some discussion about some key targets that we should be looking at around closing the global biodiversity finance gap, ensuring that countries develop national biodiversity finance plans and implement them, the need for additional resource flows to developing countries to help them implement those national strategies. And lastly, and we heard this from John, the need to also invest in improving data sets and provisions for data collection and storage, and the ability to scale data to the landscape level, not just at the national level, so that it can actually be actionable by stakeholders, local communities, indigenous peoples, and other actors in the real economy. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Does Ono want to add something? Ono van Evel? Yes, your hand is raised. Please give the floor to Ono van Evel from
Hello.
UNDP. Yes.
Hope you can hear me. Yes, thank you. So just to add only very few points that weren't mentioned yet. So first of all, we had a comment on the CBD process that the topic that relates to the financial sector kind of cuts across different working streams, mainstreaming, resource mobilization, targets and indicators. And it would be great to somehow streamline this process better if you want to engage effectively with the financial sector. The second sort of thought was that there's a lot of attention for the so-called biodiversity positive expenditures and investments. And perhaps there's a need to look more at guidance for what are the negative ones. And there was an idea raised of a brown taxonomy that can complement a green taxonomy. And perhaps something like this could be referred to in the CBD process. And last but not least, there was also a recommendation to look at regulatory approaches and see if any suggestion can be made. While that suggestion should not be prescriptive, but should sort of leave it to the national context to define what can be done here, but nonetheless give a strong signal to explore regulatory options. So those are just a few points from my side, and thank you for enabling me to give the contribution.
Thank you, Ono. So I see several hands raised. So I will give you the floor just for one point to be added, because I would like to give the floor to some questions from the public, and after that we'll have to conclude. So Martin Locke from Capital Coalition, please. Can your hand is raised, moderator? Please.
Yes, thanks. I just want to add to the points raised so far, the need for implementation and also to have an independent force that really is ensuring the implementation. So we were even speaking about who will be the police that ensures that what we have agreed in the negotiation is implemented actually. So implement is one of the things that we really discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Anita De Hort from Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, please.
Can you see me? Okay, yes. You can't see me. Something wrong.
But we can hear you, so please.
Perfect. Okay. One thing to add, what was really interesting from somebody in our group from the private finance sector who has a lot of experience in the Paris Agreement negotiations, and he talked about the Kyoto surprise. To look at pricing carbon, what's then the Kyoto surprise, to look at investigations on pricing on nature. Sort of nature credits idea. I thought it was really interesting to also add on all the things that have been said.
Thank you, Anita. Mariana Bello from Biofin, UNDP, for the group of governments also. Mariana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dale. Quick comment, addition to what everyone has said. Our group also discussed the importance of working on positive incentives and the role that the finance sector can have in promoting positive nature investments, and not only focusing on avoiding negative impacts. And finally, the importance of working on capacity building and the role that both the scientific community and governments can play in supporting capacity building for the finance sector in understanding the risks and dependencies on biodiversity and the different metrics they can use. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I see finance for, Jeremy, you wanted to add something? Very quick.
Very quick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, very, very quickly. Something I left out of mine and has been referred to elsewhere, and I just want to emphasize it. It was about the relationship between the feedback loop that it was suggested in our group needs to be created between the kind of overarching targets that the GBF provides, whether it's nature positive or something else, clarity on what that means for the real economy, so for corporates, the financial sector as enablers, and then the feedback loop back again to governments. So these things that have been touched on, John Toynbee mentioned corporates and the real economy, but these things are not independent, they're interactive. And so where does the financial sector fit in providing the oil, but also the messages? And these are messages come in both directions. So I just want to emphasize that's quite an important intersection. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Jeremy. I will take, before closing and trying to synthesize what you said, I will give the floor to one other person from the assistants, Mrs. Marela Monteiro, from Bank Track. You just have 1 minute to speak, Mrs. Monteiro. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for giving me the space to talk. I just have one observation more specifically about the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, more specific on the limitations on its enforceability, around the questions that there are on who is implementing, who is responsible for the implementation, what powers or scope do they have, what level of scrutiny would be exercised, and how much transparency we would have, because I think this reporting framework could be very, very important for the corporate sector and for financial sector as a whole. But on the other hand, this lack of clarity on the enforceability, it creates a certain limitation on the effectiveness, and I think that it would only be overcome with a mandatory reporting system with binding targets promoted by the governments of the member states of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We heard your message on TNFD. So now we are arriving at the end of this panel. Thanks a lot all for, and above all to the chairs for preparing all this work, to the note taker also who helps you, and to the participants for all your rich contributions. So the synthesis is really complicated because, it's not, the point here is not to make a complete synthesis, but just to raise some key points. I will try, and as I said before, be indulgent because the time was short. I see I've noted 10 points, perhaps very quick, that the fundamental role to be played by financial institution to achieve the objectives, goals, targets, and so on of the global biodiversity framework. It's nothing new, and it has really to be taken into account. But with what the bemol, if I could say, that we heard, there is really, we heard that yesterday and today also, an important need of clarity of what is now in the global biodiversity framework, of clarity of definitions of terms needed, used, and so on. That's something which was really said on different ways today, and yesterday also. But that's important. We also need of global guidance, either by the GB for the financial sector, either by the global biodiversity framework as an overarching framework at international level, but also at local level, with a need of regulations. So some institutions say not too strong regulations, and we hear from the civil society very strong regulation, but nevertheless a need of regulation as a guidance to help financial sector to see where they have to go. But it's not enough regulation. There is also a need with some tools. Taxonomy was very often mentioned, but taxonomy with what are the green projects to finance, but what are also the brown projects to not finance, as a sort of exclusion list and a sort of approval list, if I could say. There is also a need to take into account what it means to finance the transition for a financial institution, and everything linked also with the client. And we heard the need of scenario planning to really know where to go, what are the different ways to go to these goals and targets mentioned in the GBF, what to do with the strands assets, how to not destroy the business, because it's not possible to destroy the business for a financial institution and for a corporate also. So really this need of guidance. This need of strong cooperation also between all the actors, and above all at a local level. We didn't speak a lot today of the national biodiversity plan or strategy, which are developed by governments, but that's true that at that level a strong cooperation could take place, and it's surely linked with what Jeremy said regarding the feedback loop. So I'm surely forgetting a lot of things in this very, very short synthesis, and excuse me if I did forget things, but it's a strange exercise to do so quick. Another point which is also interesting is the timing, because and I saw that also in my previous experience in a bank, the timing of the financial people is not the timing of the civil society, of the government, and of the environment also. And financing very quick a project when the impact and results will be seen or could be seen in a longer time is sometimes difficult also. So in this scenario, that's perhaps something to take into account. So thanks a lot once again to all of you. We are not finished. Now I will introduce the last part of our workshop and invite Mr. Basile Van Havre and Francis Ogwal, and please raise your hands to react on what they just heard, on what they heard also yesterday during the meeting, and perhaps to express their views on that, and to say also what will be the key takeaway from this workshop that you could or will take into account when you are writing the next draft of the GBF. Basile, I see you here. You have the floor.
Thank you. And I'll start by not doing what you asked me to do. I was quite taken by the offer from the Netherlands about continuing the work and some kind of a task force, etc. Actually, while I was listening to the summaries, it became clear to me that we have groups that take care of science. The IPBES, we have the IPCC on the climate side. It would be great to have a group that take care of finance, that is there and that is a presence in our discussion and a way and a place where we can refer to. So is that task force going to be that group? How are we going to be setting up a capacity and a dialogue place for the long term? Those are questions I have, and I certainly welcome the offer from the Netherlands and looking forward to have more dialogue on that. Now, back to what I'm actually asked to say. Definitely, we heard you. I won't repeat the summary from Odile. That's notion of the guidance, the certainty, the coherence, and the need to be having integrated scenario planning capacity resonate very strongly with me. So I don't want to dwell anymore. I'm looking forward to the outcome and the report. There was lots of very interesting debate, and I'm really glad I was invited and be able to be part of your conversation. What I'm really looking forward is next step and how do we continue that. So thank you very much. Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, co-chair. I think a lot has been really shared since yesterday and today. And having participated in the development of the strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020, I must say that this has been a very unique opportunity for us really to engage a little bit, if not much more deeper, on how we are going to really involve the finance sector or the private sector in the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. How do we handle some of the issues they have said we should take care of? So this is what didn't happen in the other one. And we are only saying involve the private sector, but this has really brought a lot into the fore on what we need to be looking at. Some of the things like clarity, making the framework as simple as possible, capacity building, as Coach has said, that linkage of climate change, financing to biodiversity, and so forth, nature-based solution. These are all things that we've been thinking about, but now we need to be looking at how perhaps we are going to be addressing the issue of finance sector into all this. So this has been very, very good input coming from you people, and we thank you for really enriching our thinking in this whole aspect of the finance sector. I must say I'm better off than I came yesterday. So we look forward to interacting with you more as we work on this framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil and Francis. That's really, really good to hear what you said, and also to thank you to be with everyone these 2 days, these 2 sessions, because you all have a lot of things to do, and you stay. You were also in the breakout groups. I saw your name, so really, really, really thank you to participate to all this workshop, and I think the dialogue begun or was still beginning before, but that was an important moment for you all to speak together, and I'm sure, as you say, that it will continue. So now I have the pleasure to introduce Mr. Eric Usher from UNEP FI. Eric, yes, you raise your hand. As representative of one of the major group of private financial institutions, can you tell us what also you are thinking from all these proposals, and will you support them? How will you make the link with your members? Eric, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Odile, and I'm really pleased to be with you to provide closing remarks, both on behalf of myself and Fiona Reynolds of the PRI, who unfortunately is ill today. So I think, the last 2 days have really offered a really valued reflection on the actions that financial institutions can be taking to shift finance from nature negative to nature positive. And I think it's fed some tangible actions that governments and public finance can do to help establish this, the so-called enabling environment, both through the global biodiversity framework and certainly other policy tools and incentives. Certainly it's an unprecedented time for mutual exchange. This is when we need to be doing it, and for understanding between financial actors as you are starting or detailed into negotiating the GBF. And we really want to congratulate the CBD Secretariat, Elizabeth, yourself, Odile, and the team, and the working group co-leads for initiating this really, really valuable and appreciated exchange. I think a clear message was the need to move together at the necessary scale and urgency of the problem, and of course prioritizing the avoidance of harm. Regarding scale, the recent State of Finance for Nature report that we released detailed the need to close a $4.1 trillion US financing gap annually by 2050 for nature. This is certainly a long way to go from the current roughly $133 billion per year that we see today, and most of which is public. 86% is public finance today. So the private sector is not playing a significant role. So new nature positive product lines and portfolios are certainly needed, and they need to be innovated quickly. Regarding urgency, if we're going to bend the curve of nature loss by 2030, financial institutions need to immediately challenge their clients to set science-based targets for nature. And financial institutions need to come together in making collective commitments to nature-positive portfolios. And this is the alignment concept that we've been talking about, or as many have been referring to. In terms of avoiding harm first, yesterday, actually, UNEP, we launched a financial exclusion list for marine areas. And our forthcoming Principles for Responsible Banking guidance will be launched next week, including potential exclusions for terrestrial and freshwater areas as well. So within the financial sector, I think there's a growing recognition of the value of nature and increasing understanding of our dependencies and impacts on the world around us. And with this recognition comes the need to integrate biodiversity data into financial models. An exciting proposal from this workshop is the notion of setting up some sort of multi-stakeholder approach to biodiversity data challenges. So sort of imagining some sort of sustainably funded and capacitated conservation sector who could provide biodiversity data for the corporate and financial sector and other actors through some sort of common platform, certainly within a common good. Financial institutions can take action through the appropriate structures and mechanisms. First, to engage with investees to influence their strategies and call on their clients to set science-based targets. They can do this to assess, measure, and set targets to manage their impacts on biodiversity, including for banks through the forthcoming PRB guidance on biodiversity target setting, which is in development. They can do it to allocate capital from harmful activities and direct capital towards nature-positive activities. To engage with initiatives such as the Align Project and PBAF to set common measurement approaches. And finally, to support the TNFD to develop harmonized reporting and disclosure for nature-related financial risks and opportunities. So UNIPIFI and PRI, we stand ready to support our banking, insurance, and investment members in this shift, building on and consolidating the valued experience that's been built up on climate change, and also ourselves at PRI through our recently launched Joint Investment Leadership Program. I think the collaboration between financial institutions and all sectors is the way forward. And I think by working together, financial institutions, businesses, and policymakers can really be increasing effectively in how we drive forward, how we push the needle on biodiversity loss and long-term nature gain. Thank you. Back to you, Odile.
Thank you, Eric, for your relevant points and your support to private financial institutions, as well as that provided by UNPRI to investors, and also by other organizations as Finance for Biodiversity Pledge Foundation is really and will be really useful in the future. So without waiting, because we are just 1 minute after the normal time, I will give the floor to, for the conclusion of the workshop, to Mr. David Cooper, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention for Biological Diversity. And without that, I will say you sorry once again. Thank you for all. Thank you to all, and see you soon. So David, you have the last word.
Thank you very much, Odile, and I'm really pleased to have this chance to be with you, and above all to thank you and everyone involved in this workshop. I think it's been extremely rich. I certainly have learned a lot. I'm sure everyone has learned a lot from each other. Thanks in the first instance to the experts that worked with us in the Secretariat in developing this workshop. And a big thanks also to the Secretariat team, and on the substantive side, on the logistical side, and especially to you, Odile, for driving this forward. You've done a marvelous job, and it's great, and I think a testament of the job you've done to see the range of experts and of the institutions that they represent participating over these 2 days. I'd like to thank, of course, our co-chairs also, Basile and Francis, the co-chairs of the Post-2020 process, for being with us, and all the speakers, panelists and chairs of the sessions. And of course, all the participants in the workshop, and especially everyone that's participated so actively in the breakout sessions earlier today. We've had a summary, a very good summary, I think, presented just now by a number of the facilitators and moderators. And as we note, a fuller report will be prepared and made available on the website. All of this information will be really useful to the co-chairs, as we've heard, to the Secretariat, and I expect to all the parties and other delegates in the process, including the upcoming third meeting of the working group on the Post-2020 framework at the end of August, and then subsequently in our other meetings leading up to COP15. Of course, this won't be the end of the process. We know that there'll be a number of other initiatives that are happening through many of the institutions, initiatives, pledges that have been involved in these meetings. And perhaps we'll also consider organising another event as may be needed later on. Also want to just announce that on Monday we'll be launching the Key Actions for Nature financial sector guide to the Convention on Biological Diversity that's been co-produced by UNEP FI, PRI, Business for Nature, the Finance for Nature, for Biodiversity Pledge, and the CBD Secretariat. Clearly, it's, and as others have said just now, if we're going to succeed in halting, reducing, and restoring biodiversity, if we're going to succeed in bending the curve of biodiversity loss, massive changes have to happen. And obviously the finance plays such a key role in that, and aligning financial flows to the imperative of bending the curve of biodiversity loss is key. We know, of course, the global biodiversity framework is still under negotiation, but it's clear that so many things will need to change, and finance will have a key role in that. And this will need to involve everyone, the financial institutions, public and private, government, and including, of course, as we've heard and has been emphasized just now, the central banks and regulators, but also wider civil society, the scientific community, and others. Everyone will have a major role in that. The job of the global biodiversity framework, the purpose of it will be to try and make these very difficult changes that have got to happen a little bit easier, to facilitate those changes. And I think we've learned a lot in this workshop about what elements could be included in that framework to do that in terms of aligning or realigning financial flows. So again, big thank you to you, Adil, and to everyone that's been involved in this workshop. And we look forward to continuing to work with you all as we go forward towards COP15. Thank you. And I guess we close the workshop.
Yeah.
So,
bye-bye, everyone.